start by removing the wheel, 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts. Okay, remove your wheel. 17mm socket, remove these 2 nuts and this bolt. 19mm socket, remove this long bolt that goes through the rear bushing of the control arm. Now with a 19mm wrench, I'm going to hold the nut at the top here and 19mm socket, remove this through bolt that goes through the bushing of the control arm. All right, remove the nut and let's finish taking the bolt out. With a pick, I'm going to remove this cap here. That's going to expose the mounting nut for the engine mount on this side, which we have to remove so we can jack up the engine slightly because one of the control arm bolts is actually underneath the engine mount bracket. So now with a 17mm, remove 3 nuts that hold on the motor mount. Next, I want to undo the sway bar bracket, and I'm doing that so that I can remove the steering rack bolt so that I can jack up the engine and make the subframe potentially drop a little bit if needed. Because this being an all-wheel drive model, it won't let you raise the engine too much because the differential will hit the steering rack. So I'm going to heat up the nut on the back side of this 12mm bolts to hopefully help it break free. And I'm going to remove the sway bar from the subframe. All right, there's one bolt. I'm going to try to remove this front one as well. Okay, there's the second bolt. All right, let's do the same to this side. Here's this third one. Okay, and here's the last bolt. Now you can grab the sway bar and lift it up. If these brackets fall off, just make sure you take them out and then put them back when the time comes. But now that this is up, you can get to the 2 big steering rack bolts to unbolt them so that when I drop the subframe, this can stay up with the engine. 19mm socket on this bolt, and I'm going to use a 17 wrench to hold the nut on the back side. Let's remove this bolt. There we go. Now let's do the same to the passenger side. Okay, the nut came off. Let's pull the bolt through. There we go. Remove the bolt. All right, next I want to undo this rear motor mount. It has 2 bolts on the bracket here. I'm going to remove both of those. 17mm socket on both. There's one. Undo the other. Perfect. And this bracket, you can either take it out or just leave it there. I'm going to leave it there. Next, I want to remove this 19mm nut for the top of this engine mount. Break it free, and then remove it the rest of the way. Now I'm going to jack up the engine, and I'm going right on the differential here. You can go on the oil pan, but just make sure you have a nice large piece of wood that covers a lot of this surface area. You don't want to dent the oil pan by just going in one spot, so that's why I'm going on the differential. That'll raise the whole engine and transmission. So I'm going to go up a couple inches. Okay, right there it feels like it wants to stop, so I'm not going to force it. I'm going to pry the steering rack up a little bit out of its mounting locations. This being the all-wheel drive model, the differential wants to hit the steering rack as you jack up the engine. All right, so I'm going to stop right there. Now I'm going to remove this splash shield here. Usually there are push clips, but someone used self-tappers all along the front, so I'm just going to remove all those. Okay, this comes off. Again, there should be more push clips holding it to the bumper. I guess not in my case. Now I'm going to remove the 3 bolts that hold this front motor mount on. There's one right here. There's one. There's one right through this hole here. Usually there's a cap, a plastic cap that you have to pop off. This one's missing. And there's one right here next to the transmission pan. All right, perfect. Now I'm going to take a pry bar, just pry up on this bracket here and down on the mount. Try to kind of get this engine mount to come out of there. Perfect. Now you can remove it, and now we can access our lower control arm bolt. All right, now with a 22mm socket, you can access the 2 bolts for the front part of the control arm. Let's remove those. There's one. There's the second one. It's still in there. There we go. Let's pry it off the ball joint first. There we go. Move the ball joint out of the way. And now remove it from the subframe. I'm going to pry the rear bushing out. There it is. There's your old control arm. On the old control arm, you'll notice this spacer piece here. You don't want to forget about this. Take it off and put it on the new control arm in the same orientation that it came out. This is what helps space it off the subframe at the correct angle. If you don't put this in, this bushing is going to be at the wrong angle. It's going to prematurely wear, and you might even get funny feeling in your steering wheel as you drive down the road. Like I said before, take this spacer plate and install it right where the old one used to be. Now let's install the control arm. I'm going to start the rear bushing in first. That's the more difficult one to start just because it always wants to sit at an angle. But if you grab a hammer and just tap it in, as soon as it lines up at the bottom, I'm going to start the bolt in so that it can stay. Okay. There we go. Drive it up the rest of the way. And now to get the top to line up, here's a little trick. If you grab the appropriate size socket for this bolt, use it to pry the bolt into place and drive it through the rest of the way. There you go. And the nut on top, I'm not going to tighten it yet, but I just want to put it on so that the bolt doesn't accidentally fall out for whatever reason. So that's done. Let's move to the front bolts. I cleaned up the threads on these bolts, applied some new thread locker, and I'm going to start them into the control arm, thread them on by hand to start, that way they don't cross thread. And something's making this one not line up, so I'm just going to use my pry bar, kind of make sure that it does line up and go in. I'm going to just slowly thread these on. Ooh, the socket on first. right, that one's in. Let's do the front one. Now let's torque them. 148 foot-pounds for both of these. Let's bottom this one out now. And let's also torque this one to 148 foot-pounds. Let's reinstall the motor mount. Put it onto the bottom 3 bolts first. And then I'm going to use a pry bar. And I'm just going to try to pry this bracket up and the engine mount down so it can slide into its spot here. I'm just going to pry the engine up and push the motor mount in. Perfect. Now that it's in place, let's lower our support and make sure that the engine falls down into the engine mount over there where it's supposed to. All right. Everything is going down exactly how it's supposed to. Just keep an eye on everything. Make sure nothing gets crushed or pinched. All right, now we can remove our support and let's install all the things that we took off. I'm going to take my pry bar, go into this hole on the control arm and pry up against the subframe to lower the control arm, grab the ball joint and line it up with the bolt holes. Sometimes you might have to push on the knuckle a little bit to get it to fully seat. Perfect. Let's put the 2 nuts and bolt back on. Let's reinstall these 2 nuts here. And I'm going to snug these up first. That's going to pull the top of the ball joint down. Then I can install the bolt. $94 foot-pounds for all 3 of these. Perfect. Let's get these 3 nuts back on for the front engine mount. One over here, one underneath, and one right here through the subframe. Snug them up. 47 foot-pounds for all the lower motor mount bolts or nuts. Let's reinstall the splash shield. Mine was just held on by self-tappers, but whatever you had holding yours on, just reattach it that way. Now let's reattach this side motor mount with the 3 17mm nuts. 48 foot-pounds for these as well. Let's get the upper nut for this side engine mount on. Snug it up. Let's torque it. 48 foot-pounds for this as well. Let's reattach this engine mount bracket back there. I'm going to try and start the bolt in. Well, both of them. Start them in by hand, and then I'll snug them up. I'm going to snug both of these up. I can't really get my torque wrench in here, so I'm just going to make them tight with my air gun. Now let's slide in this bolt here for the steering rack. All right, make sure it comes out the other side. It has not come out yet, so it must not be perfectly lined up. Let me get a hammer, tap it through. Perfect. Let's put the nut on the other side, and then we'll attach the other side bolt before I actually tighten these up. This side doesn't quite line up, so I'm going to pry the rack up, and I think this is lined up now. So I'm going to slide this bolt through. There we go. Push the sway bar out of your way, and make sure that the bolt goes all the way through. Let's reattach the nut on the back side of the bolt. Let's snug this up. 17 millimeter wrench on the nut and 19 socket on the bolt side. Now let's do the other side and then I'll come back and torque both of them. All right, hold the nut. 52 foot-pounds for both of these bolts. I might have to hold on to the other side nut. I guess not. Okay, let's do the other side. All right, let's get the sway bar back in. So there were these brackets, one on each side. If yours came off, then go ahead and reinstall them. Make sure the area is clean. And line them back up to where they are supposed to go. Before I start in the bolts, I'm going to do the other side bracket, slide that one back on. That way I can move the sway bar up and down. And now that that's done, let's grab some bolts. Line up the bolts with the bolt holes and start them in. There's one. Let's do the one in the back. Okay, that one's in. Let's do the other side now. Now snug them all up. And I can't really torque these because, well, it's pretty difficult to get a torque wrench in this space, so I'm just going to make them nice and tight with my ratchet. I'm going to go back and forth on these. That way this bracket can seat itself evenly and not be kind of crooked at an angle. Now I'm just going to check them all, make sure they're nice and tight. That's perfect right there. Need an extension for the one in the back. Nice and tight. Let's check the other side. Yep, that was tight. And let's check the one in the back. All right, nice and tight. Perfect. Let's go ahead and put the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, snug them up, and then torque them to 76 foot-pounds. 76 foot-pounds. All right, now you can go ahead and get yourself in alignment.